Before we went to the break, we were talking about NBC's decision to hire Rona McDaniel and whether TV stations like NBC should be turning to ex-politicos like her. And I cut Lord Darroch off in mid-flow, so I'm going to return to it, Lord Darroch. We were up against a hard up, so my apologies. Do pick up the thought that you were making. I was making the comparison with our Brexit debate here in the UK and the equal billing that Remainers were given alongside Brexiteers who some would argue had flawed arguments.
Yeah, as I said at the time, I think that it was very difficult at the time to both balance your coverage of Brexit and avoid giving people of different stature and different levels of expertise seemingly equal validity in the argument. I think it was a very difficult task, and I think on the whole the media did their best with it and did okay in my view. My point on the Rona McDaniel case is I think election denying is a different level. I read that more than 50% of Republicans do not believe that the result of the 2020 election was fair. And that's because people in positions of influence and authority like her have been telling them that the election was stolen. And once you start doing that, you're starting to basically make democracy crumble. So I think that's of a different level of seriousness and that's why I kind of agree with those commentators on MSNBC who were saying she shouldn't have been hired.
I want to put up on the screen, if I could, Kelly, what Liz Cheney said, who, of course, sat on the January 6th committee. She said Rona facilitated Trump's corrupt fake elector plot and his effort to pressure Michigan officials not to certify the legitimate election outcome. She spread his lies and called January 6th legitimate political discourse. That's not taking one for the team, as she put it on Sunday. It's enabling criminality and depravity. And I guess the point, Kelly, is that right now, Donald Trump is spreading the same falsehoods. In fact, he's laying the groundwork for a return to the same playbook that we had in 2020. And if you hire someone like Rona McDaniel, the anchors at NBC are saying you are legitimising that argument. Do you see the point they're making in that?
I see both perspectives from it. Absolutely. The point being that also you're giving him more airtime and you're legitimizing what happened. And so it's okay by that fact. But then there's another point, another counter argument about, is this going to be some type of censorship? Because you don't like what someone says, are you going to stop people from saying it? But ultimately, it's going to be up to the voters to make a determination on where they see the next 4 years going, of whether they want a dictator or do they want democracy. And I think that's going to be key for people in the polls.
OK, we'll move on. Thank you for that. The United States and France say there is irrefutable evidence that Friday's attack on the concert venue in Moscow, in which at least 137 people were killed, was the work of ISIS-K. That's an affiliate that operates in Central Asia. The group has released the graphic body cam footage of that attack, which could only have come from the gunman involved. The Russian authorities have accused 4 men from the former Soviet Republic of Tajikistan, though Vladimir Putin has referred only to radical Islamists without referring to the group that recruited them. And still without any proof, he claims that a window had been prepared for the attackers to escape to Ukraine, a narrative that Kremlin bloggers are now actively spreading across social media. But what do we know from the open source investigations that have been done? Joining us to discuss is Carolina Hurd. She is a Russia analyst at the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War. Thank you for being with us. So what have you discovered? Is it true that these attackers that they've arrested were heading towards the Ukrainian border?
So based off of the open source evidence that we see, the attack was very much quick and carried out in a very surgical fashion. And then there's a little bit of loss of visuals on the attackers after they re-enter their car and then leave the scene. Of course, the Russian allegation was that they were headed to Ukraine. However, the geolocated footage of where they were captured is about 90 kilometers from the border from Ukraine, or about 130 kilometers if they're going on the highway that they were apprehended on. And then as of today, the Belarusian president, Lukashenko, actually stated that they were on their way to Belarus when Russian and Belarusian special services activated and basically deterred them and forced them to go towards the Ukrainian border. So based off of now statements made by Lukashenko, they weren't headed for Ukraine in the first place. They were actually headed for Belarus. And Lukashenko has very much blown a hole in the Kremlin narrative that they were headed for Ukraine.
What about the flip side of these conspiracy theories, that the Russian intelligence apparatus was somehow involved with it, that they didn't respond quickly enough? Can you explain what you found about that?
Absolutely. So based off of the open source evidence we have, this was a massive intelligence and law enforcement failure on the part of the Russians, but it doesn't have to be anything more than that. We know that the Russians got intel from the US about a possible ISIS attack in Moscow, but due to very heavy levels of distrust between the Russians and the US, they chose not to heed those warnings. We also know that law enforcement was very, very slow in actually responding to the first reports of the shooting. So all of these are very much systemic failures. That doesn't necessarily mean that there was some sort of vast conspiracy by the Russian intelligence apparatus in planning this attack. The Islamic State has claimed it. We have no reason to believe that it was not the Islamic State. All of the attack patterns, the claim patterns, etc., are very consistent with the way that IS claims and conducts attacks. And the way that the Kremlin response is very much shattered, and it seems like all of these Russian officials are kind of running around saying different things, suggests that they were so unprepared by this attack that they don't even really have a consistent informational line following the attack,
That's
other
really
than, of course, to blame Ukraine.
Right. So they're still in shock mode and not able to put a coherent narrative together. I mean, there was clearly a warning from the Americans, which was given to the Kremlin, which Vladimir Putin duly ignored. Was there a reason why he was wary of acting on that intelligence within the Muslim communities of the Caucasus?
That's actually a phenomenal question. I think something that is being ignored in this overall discussion. I think there are several reasons why the Russians may not have acted on the intelligence. First and foremost, maybe they thought that there was no good faith reason that the US would have been offering credible intelligence. There's that basic distrust. But then also, there is this degree to which I think the Russian authorities were worried about conducting searches or crackdowns in the Muslim minority ethnic enclaves within Russia, because the Kremlin has relied so heavily on these communities to basically mobilize for the war in Ukraine. Central Asian migrant workers are very much disproportionately targeted by all of the shadow or crypto mobilization efforts that the Kremlin is undertaking, so it doesn't have to conduct general mobilization. So basically, if the Russians had acted on this intelligence and started doing searches or intelligence crackdowns in these communities, they would have risked kind of creating even more discontent and alienation within the exact communities that they're relying on to carry the burden of generating manpower for the war.
Stay there, Caroline, if you would, because let me bring in Lord Kim Derrick. I suppose some of this is really interesting that Caroline and her team have come up with, but it doesn't change the fact that after events like this in Russia, the playbook is much the same, isn't it, Kim? I mean, he's going to double down, the security will be tightened, and he will use this for the draft, to draft more people into his war in Ukraine.
Absolutely right. I mean, we've just heard a forensic analysis of why these Russian allegations are completely without foundation, and it's compelling, but it's not going to stop Putin pushing this line. And of course, within Russia, especially the way they will push it out on social media and other channels and on the main news networks and so on, it'll probably convince a lot of people. But it is fundamentally ridiculous. And what we're looking at here was a systematic failure of the Russian state, despite a warning from the US of what was going to happen, of stopping this terrorist attack happening. And this is on Putin and his regime.
Kelly, we didn't get a response from Vladimir Putin for 19 hours, and probably when he did respond, he was hoping that he could unpick some of the support that Ukraine has from the international community. I don't sense that that's happened, and I wonder, much in the way as was the case at the beginning of the war 2 years ago, whether the Americans have a role in dispelling some of these myths, some of these false flag events that the Russians would like to push.
Well, it's important that they do, because it's important to have, no matter where you are, is transparency and candor, and that is definitely, definitely key. And to your, point that was brought up earlier, that the U.S. warned of this 2 weeks prior. And so I think it's important that there is transparency and that we understand the ramifications of what happened there.
Yeah. Carolina, when you look at the draft that he's talking about, 500,000 more troops and the scaling up, some serious scaling up of military manufacturing in Russia, I mean, does your organisation think this is solely focused on Ukraine, or are they preparing for something much, much bigger?
So in terms of the military reforms that Russia is undergoing at the current moment, some of this is geared towards Ukraine. We've seen Russia standing up new armies and divisions, that sort of thing, and directly deploying them to Ukraine. But these are often quite poorly staffed, poorly trained. So they're very much just a hold the line type of formation. So a lot of the actual military reforms that are being done in the long run. And this is very much a broader conversation, but it seems as though Russia is preparing to increase its capabilities for a potential long-term conventional war against NATO or a similar adversary. And that's very much what we're seeing with the Kremlin signaling in the way that they're standing up the new military districts, armies, etc. They have an explicitly anti-NATO posture. So there's a immediate term solution or intent for some of these reforms, and then a long-term anti-NATO intent as well.
Well, on that very sobering note, Carolina Hurd, thank you very much indeed for your reporting and for coming on the programme. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
The US Supreme Court has been hearing oral arguments today in the most important case on reproductive rights since it overturned the constitutional right to abortion 2 years ago. This time the focus is on abortion medication and specifically the nationwide availability of mifepristone. The case was brought by a group called the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which is challenging the FDA's 24-year-old decision to approve the drug. The backdrop for today's hearing is the rapid rise in the use of this medication. The total number of self-managed abortions in which mifepristone was used increased by around 27,000 in the 6 months after Dobbs versus what would have been expected before that. In other words, a substantial number of people are accessing this abortion medication to get around the state bans and restrictions. Here's some of the back and forth in the courtroom earlier today.
FDA's outsourcing of abortion drug harm to respondent doctors forces them to choose between helping a woman with a life-threatening condition and violating their conscience.
The millions of Americans have used mifepristone to safely end their pregnancies. Respondents may not agree with that choice, but that doesn't give them Article 3 standing or a legal basis to upend the regulatory scheme.
Kelly, for me, this really is the big one. I mean, if the court ruled against the FDA, then potentially this would have a far greater practical effect than Dobbs did, because so many people are using this drug, even in states where abortion is banned. But from what I picked up today from those oral arguments, it looks like the justices are seeking an off-ramp.
It does. And so you bring up a really good point about if they rule that this issue with this drug, that there could be widespread ramifications of it. But I think one of the key issues in this case is standing. So in the United States, in order to bring a case, you have to have standing and you have to have some type of harm or injury. And I think that is definitely going to be key in this case of the people that are bringing this case. What is their harm? What is their injury that they incurred? I think that's a strong argument to go against them in this case.
Do you think there's a political element to this case, Kelly? Because Donald Trump's made it abundantly clear in some of his rallies that Dobbs has been a loser for Republicans. And if they were to ban the medication nationwide, that would have a fairly chilling effect, wouldn't it, on Republican voters? I mean, there is a majority of people that want abortion rights to be protected in America.
Yes, according to recent studies, a majority of Americans support a woman's right to choose. But it's interesting that Donald Trump has come out and said, I'm paraphrasing what he said, that because of him, Roe v. Wade is gone. And Roe v. Wade was the law of the land for the last 50 years that gave a woman a right to choose. And the Supreme Court recently overturned that. And so that's why it's key for voters to get out there and vote in 2024, because reproductive freedom is definitely going to be one issue on the ballot.
It always staggers me, Kim, how Donald Trump manages to straddle the horse on this. I mean, clearly you have to look at the bench, and Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, Neil Gorsuch, the three justices that he put on the bench, who have a very conservative view of abortion. And yet, I guess the view generally in the United States is that he's the roguish kind of guy that probably would encourage someone to have an abortion, indeed might have paid for one in his past. He seems to get away with it both ways.
Well, I never thought, I must say, that he was someone who was thinking like a great chess master, 4 or 5 moves ahead. I think he was sort of, thinking maybe one move ahead, and that was it. And he is responsible for Roe v. Wade being lost, as it were, because he put 3 conservative judges on the Supreme Court, who then knocked it out of the statute book. Now, I think that alone is going to potentially be a problem for the Republicans come the next general election and Donald Trump's attempt to get a second term, whatever happens on this particular case before them now, where, as you say, it looks like the judges are going to go for the status quo. So, in a way, what Donald Trump sowed with his names on the Supreme Court, with his nomination to the Supreme Court, may come back to sort of hit him in this election campaign.
Yeah, I suppose you also have to keep a close eye on the Chief Justice, John Roberts, who is concerned already about the court standing in the country. If they took a decision on this, you wonder where the opinion polls might go. Across the world and here in the UK, this is BBC News. Welcome back. Now it is time for the panel. The show where we give it over to the panel to choose the stories that they want to discuss. Kelly, you get to go first tonight. What is it that you want to talk about?
Donald Trump's hush money case. So Donald Trump is set to go to trial next month in the hush money case. So that is a case in regards to allegations that business records were falsified. And so that is set to go to trial now next month. The judge recently issued a gag order. And so what is a gag order in the US? It stops a person from stating particular things. And so Donald Trump has a gag order, so he can't talk negatively about the witnesses, the judge, so the attorneys in the case.
Which he has done before. I mean, is it easy to impose a gag order in an election year?
Well, it's you have to look at it from the standpoint it's limited for the case itself. And then if he does violate it, which there's allegations that it's already been violated, then ultimately it will be up to that judge to make a determination on what the penalty should be, if any, for violating a court order.
He says he's going to stand trial. He's going to testify in this case. Would you advise that as his lawyer?
Well, ultimately, it is up to the counsel to advise them, and it's up to them to say whether they want to testify or not.
Yeah.
I would never represent Donald Trump, but most likely I would think that they would
only because you'd never get paid. Only because you'd never get paid. Kim, you want to talk about?
That's not the only reason.
Not the only reason. Maybe not. No. Okay. Kim, you always come up with a good one. You want to talk about Albert the alligator, who's been confiscated in New York.
Yes, alligator, 11 foot long, 340 kilograms, has been seized from a family home in New York State. How you seize 11-foot alligator, I'm not sure, but anyway, that's what's happened, because the license to keep this alligator has expired. The alligator, apparently, apart from living in the home, used to share the swimming pool in this house with the family and with guests. So we share the swimming pool with children, it's a kind of only in America story, this.
Yeah. Never mind the license expiring. I'm amazed the owner hasn't expired. Trying to fit it with a jersey like he did.
And the owner's trying to get the alligator back because he's worried about his welfare.
Yeah.
So,
and you wonder why everybody got the pool to themselves in that house. We're out of time. Lord Darrick, Kelly Hyman, lovely to have your company this evening. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Join us for that.